The alarm started blaring at exactly 3 in the morning, and Captain Lisa Monroe rolled out of her bunk with the practiced ease of someone who had been woken up by emergencies more times than she could count, and she grabbed her jacket while running toward the bridge, because when an alarm went off in deep space, it usually meant something very bad was happening. Her crew was already at their stations when she arrived, and Kelly O'Brien, her weapons officer, looked up from her console with worried eyes and said that they had picked up a distress beacon from Sector 7, which was strange because that area was supposed to be empty, and Lisa told her to bring it up on the main screen. The signal was weak and broken, but it was definitely a distress call, and Lisa recognized the frequency as belonging to an elven vessel, which made her pause because humans and elves had a complicated history, and most elves preferred to handle their own problems without asking for help from anyone, especially not from humans. But a distress call was a distress call, and Lisa had never been the type to ignore someone in trouble. So she ordered her navigator Amy Chen to plot a course to the signal source and told her engineer Pete Wilson to give her maximum speed because whoever was out there might not have much time left. The journey took 4 hours, and with each passing minute, the distress signal grew weaker until it was barely more than a whisper in the darkness, and when they finally arrived at the coordinates, Lisa felt her stomach drop because the scene before them was like something out of a nightmare. 2 ships floated dead in space, and both were torn apart by weapon fire and debris scattered everywhere, creating a field of twisted metal and broken dreams. And the larger vessel had been an elven research ship based on its design, but now it was just a shell with gaping holes where the hull had been breached. The smaller ship looked like it might have been a raider craft, and it was in even worse condition than the elven vessel, which suggested that there had been a serious fight, and someone had used some very powerful weapons, and Lisa wondered what could have been valuable enough to cause this much destruction. Kelly ran her scanners over both vessels, and at first she found nothing. But then her board lit up with a single life sign coming from a small pod attached to the elven ship, and Lisa immediately ordered her crew to prepare for a rescue operation because one survivor was better than none. The rescue team suited up and took the shuttle across to the damaged vessel, and Lisa went with them because she always led from the front, and as they approached the pod, they could see that it was held together by emergency seals, and whatever was inside had very little time left before life support failed completely. They cut through the outer airlock and pulled the pod into their shuttle, and when they opened it, they found a woman inside who was tall and elegant even in her current state, with pointed ears and silver hair that fell past her shoulders, and she was barely conscious, but she held a metal container against her chest with a grip so tight that her knuckles had turned white. Lisa tried to take the container to make the woman more comfortable, but the elf's eyes snapped open, and they were the color of ancient forests and filled with such determination that Lisa actually took a step back, and the woman whispered in accented human language that she could not let go of the container because it held the last hope for her entire species. They brought her back to the main ship and laid her on a medical bed, and the doctor, whose name was Rita Hayes, tried to examine her, but the elf woman refused treatment until she could open the container and make sure its contents were safe. And Lisa decided to honor that request, because sometimes you had to trust people, even when it seemed crazy. The woman's name was Serena, and when she opened the container with shaking hands, 3 small creatures emerged that made everyone in the medical bay gasp, because they were dragons, and not the huge fire-breathing monsters from old Earth stories, but small, delicate beings with scales that shimmered like captured starlight, and eyes that seemed far too intelligent for animals. The dragons were each about the size of a house cat, and they moved with fluid grace as they climbed up Serena's arms and nestled against her neck and shoulders, and they made soft chirping sounds that seemed to calm her immediately. And she closed her eyes and whispered something in her own language that sounded like a prayer. Rita managed to convince Serena to let her run some scans, and the results showed that the elf was exhausted and dehydrated but otherwise unharmed. And Lisa sat down beside the bed and asked what had happened, and Serena's story made her blood run cold. Serena explained that she was a xenobiologist who specialized in endangered species, and these 3 dragons were the last breeding pair and their offspring from a species that had once filled the skies of the elven homeworld, but had been hunted to near extinction, and she had been transporting them to a secure facility where they could be studied and bred to restore their population. But word had leaked about her cargo, and a raider gang had ambushed her ship in deep space, demanding that she hand over the dragons because they could be sold for an enormous fortune to collectors who did not care about conservation or the survival of species, and Serena had refused. The raiders had attacked, and her small crew had fought back with everything they had, and in the end both ships had been crippled and everyone except Serena had died, and she had managed to get herself and the dragons into the emergency pod before her ship's reactor had gone critical, and now she was alone in hostile space with no way to complete her mission. Lisa listened to the story and felt anger burning in her chest because she hated raiders with a passion, and she hated even more the kind of people who would destroy something precious just to make money. And she made a decision right there that she knew her crew would support. She told Serena that they would help her get to her destination, and that they would make sure the dragons arrived safely no matter what it took, and Serena looked at her with disbelief, because elves and humans were not exactly friends, and she asked why Lisa would risk her ship and crew for strangers. Lisa thought about how to answer and finally said that humans had a long history of almost going extinct themselves, and they remembered what it felt like to be helpless and alone, and they had promised themselves that they would never stand by and watch another species suffer the same fate. And besides, helping people was just the right thing to do. Serena started crying then, and the dragons seemed to sense her emotions because they pressed closer to her and made concerned sounds, and Kelly brought a blanket and draped it over the elf's shoulders, and Rita gave her some water and food, and slowly the medical bay filled with crew members who had heard about their unusual passengers. Amy plotted a course to the nearest elven outpost, which was 2 weeks away, through some very dangerous territory, and Pete checked the engines and weapon systems to make sure they were ready for trouble, because Lisa had a feeling that the raiders who had attacked Serena would not give up so easily. The dragons seemed curious about their new surroundings, and one of them, a female with golden scales, climbed down from Serena and walked across the medical bed to investigate Kelly, who stood very still as the creature sniffed her hand and then chirped happily and rubbed against her fingers like a cat. Serena smiled for the first time since they had found her and said that the dragons could sense good intentions, and they liked Kelly, which meant she had a pure heart, and Kelly blushed and said she had always loved animals and asked if she could help take care of them during the journey. Lisa watched this interaction and felt something warm settle in her chest, because this was why she had become a spacer in the first place, because out here among the stars you could make a real difference in people's lives, and sometimes you could even help save an entire species from extinction. She turned to her crew and told them to prepare for departure because they had a mission now, and it was going to be dangerous, but it was also going to be worth it. And every single person on that bridge nodded and returned to their stations with determination in their eyes. The ship's engines hummed to life, and they left the debris field behind and headed toward elven space. And in the medical bay, Serena held her dragons close and whispered thanks to a crew of humans who had decided that some things were more important than politics or history. The first 3 days of the journey passed quietly, and Serena spent most of her time in the cargo bay that Lisa had converted into a temporary habitat for the dragons, and the crew took turns visiting to watch the fascinating creatures and learn about them from their guardian, who seemed grateful for the company. And the distraction from her grief, Kelly became particularly attached to the dragons, and she spent every free moment she had helping Serena care for them, and the golden-scaled female that had first approached her now followed Kelly around like a devoted puppy, and Serena explained that dragons bonded with people they trusted, and this one had chosen Kelly as her friend. The dragon's name was Shimmer, and her mate was a larger male with blue scales called Frost, and their offspring was a small energetic creature with mixed coloring that Serena had named Hope because she represented the future of the entire species, and watching them play together filled the cargo bay with an atmosphere of joy that the crew had not felt in a long time. Lisa visited the bay every evening after her shift ended, and she would sit with Serena and talk about everything from dragon biology to the politics between humans and elves, and slowly they began to understand each other better, and the walls that separated their species started to crumble. Just a little bit. Serena explained that dragons were not just animals, but highly intelligent beings that could form deep emotional connections with other species, and they had once been partners with the elves, helping them build their civilization and bringing prosperity to their worlds. But when a plague had swept through the dragon population centuries ago, the elves had lost not just animals but friends and family members. The few dragons that survived had been so traumatized that they had hidden away in remote places and refused to interact with anyone, and over time their numbers had dwindled until only these three remained, and Serena had spent 10 years earning their trust and convincing them that not all people were dangerous. Lisa listened to these stories and felt a growing respect for Serena, because it took real dedication to spend a decade of your life trying to save a species that most people had given up on, and she understood why the elf had been willing to fight to the death rather than let raiders take her dragons. On the fourth day, the peace ended when Amy detected 3 ships approaching from behind, and their signatures matched known raider vessels. And Lisa immediately called her crew to battle stations and told Serena to stay in the cargo bay with the dragons and keep them calm no matter what happened. The raider ships were fast and well armed, and their commander sent a message demanding that Lisa hand over the elf and her cargo, and in return they would let the human ship go unharmed, and Lisa responded by telling them exactly where they could shove their offer. And Kelly laughed despite the tension because her captain never backed down from bullies. The raiders opened fire, and Lisa threw her ship into evasive maneuvers that would have made a test pilot jealous, and she headed straight for a nearby asteroid field because she knew that big raider ships were not as maneuverable as her smaller vessel, and she could use that to her advantage. Kelly targeted the lead ship and fired a spread of missiles that forced it to break formation, and Pete rerouted power from non-essential systems to the shields because they were going to need every bit of protection they could get, and Amy plotted escape routes through the asteroids in case they needed to run. The battle was intense, and the ship shook with every hit they took, but Lisa flew like someone possessed, weaving between asteroids and using the terrain to her advantage, and she led the raiders on a chase through the densest part of the field, where one wrong move would mean instant death. One of the raider ships was not careful enough, and it clipped an asteroid and spun out of control before exploding in a brilliant flash that lit up the darkness, and the other 2 raiders became more cautious after that, which gave Kelly the opening. She needed to take out their weapon systems with precision shots down in the cargo bay. Serena held the dragons close and sang to them in her ancient language, and something strange began to happen because the dragons started to glow with an inner light that grew brighter with each verse of her song, and the light spread throughout the cargo bay and then beyond into the corridors of the ship. Lisa felt the change immediately because suddenly her controls became more responsive, and the shields strengthened, and she did not understand what was happening, but she was not going to question good luck, and she pressed her advantage and drove the remaining raiders back with a series of aggressive maneuvers. The light from the dragons formed a shimmering barrier around the hull, and when the raider weapons hit it, they simply bounced off without causing any damage. And the raiders must have realized they were facing something beyond their understanding because they suddenly broke off their attack and jumped away to hyperspace, leaving the human ship victorious. Lisa set the ship on autopilot and ran down to the cargo bay to find Serena collapsed on the floor with the dragons curled around her protectively, and their glow was fading but still visible, and Kelly was already there checking on them, and she reported that they were all alive, just exhausted. Rita arrived with medical equipment, and she scanned Serena and said that the elf had pushed herself too hard but would recover with rest, and Lisa knelt beside Serena and asked what had happened. And the elf opened her eyes weakly and smiled and said that the dragons had protected their friends. She explained that dragons had ancient magic that allowed them to create shields and enhance the abilities of those they trusted. But using this power required a deep bond between the dragon and their partner, and it drained energy from both the dragons and the person singing to them, and she had not been sure it would work because she had never tried it in combat before. Kelly looked at the 3 dragons with new respect, and she gently stroked Shimmer's scales, and the golden dragon chirped softly and nuzzled her hand, and Kelly said that she had never seen anything so beautiful or so powerful, and she thanked them for saving the ship over the next few hours. The dragons slowly regained their strength, and Serena recovered enough to sit up and drink some water, and the crew gathered in the cargo bay to hear the full story, and Serena told them about the ancient partnership between elves and dragons, and how that bond had made both species stronger. Lisa realized that what they were protecting was not just three rare animals, but living links to a forgotten age when different species had worked together in harmony, and she made a silent promise that she would get them to safety. No matter how many raiders stood in their way, Pete suggested that they modify their route to avoid known raider territories. But Lisa shook her head because changing course would add weeks to their journey, and the dragons needed to reach the breeding facility as soon as possible. And besides, she said with a grin, humans did not run from fights, they ran toward them. Amy plotted the most direct course and calculated that they would face at least 2 more potential raider encounters before reaching Elven space. But the crew voted unanimously to continue on the dangerous path because they had seen what the dragons could do, and they believed in their mission. Serena watched these humans argue and laugh and make plans, and she felt something she had not expected, which was hope, because she had spent so long alone in her quest to save the dragons, and now she had allies who were willing to risk everything to help her, and she understood why humans had such a fierce reputation across the galaxy. That night, Kelly stayed in the cargo bay, and Shimmer curled up next to her, and the dragon's warmth was comforting. And Kelly whispered to her about Earth and all the animals she had loved as a child, and Shimmer seemed to listen with understanding in her ancient eyes. Lisa sat on the bridge and watched the stars and thought about how strange life could be, because a week ago she had been hauling cargo and complaining about boring routes, and now she was in the middle of an adventure that would probably become a legend. And she smiled because this was exactly the kind of life she had always wanted. Word spread fast through the criminal networks of the sector, and by the end of the week every pirate and raider within 3 systems knew about the human ship carrying the last dragons, and the price on their heads had grown so large that even the most cautious outlaws were willing to take the risk. Lisa knew they were being hunted because her sensors picked up multiple ships shadowing them at a distance, and she called a meeting in the mess hall to discuss their options, and her crew gathered around the table with serious faces because they all understood the danger they were facing. Serena attended the meeting with Hope perched on her shoulder, and the small dragon watched everyone with curious eyes, and Lisa laid out the situation, honestly, because she believed her crew deserved to know the truth, and she said that they could still turn back and hand Serena over to the nearest neutral station where she could wait for an elven rescue ship. The silence that followed her suggestion lasted exactly 3 seconds before Kelly slammed her hand on the table and said absolutely not. And Pete nodded and said they had come this far, and they were not quitting now. And Amy pointed out that the raiders would probably attack them anyway, even if they did surrender, because criminals rarely kept their promises. Rita said that she had joined the crew because she wanted to make a difference in the galaxy, and this was their chance to do something that mattered. And the rest of the crew voiced their agreement, and Lisa felt pride swell in her chest because these were her people, and they never backed down from doing what was right. Serena tried to speak, but her voice caught, and tears ran down her face because she had never expected this kind of loyalty from anyone, let alone from humans who had no obligation to help her. And Hope chirped and nuzzled against her cheek. Trying to comfort her guardian, Lisa stood up and said they needed a plan, because charging ahead blindly would get them all killed, and they needed to be smart about this. And she asked Serena how much the dragons had recovered from their last use of magic, and Serena said they were getting stronger, but they would need at least another week before they could create another shield. Kelly suggested that they call for help, and Lisa admitted she had already sent messages to every friend and contact she had in the sector, and several had responded saying they would meet them at the halfway point and provide escort, and it would not be much. But 3 extra ships were better than nothing. Amy reported that the raiders seemed to be gathering their forces for a major attack, and her best guess was that they would hit within the next 2 days when the human ship passed through a nebula that would interfere with sensors and communications, and it would be the perfect place for an ambush. Pete said he could modify their weapons to fire in a wider spread pattern, which would be useful against multiple targets, and Rita offered to train anyone who wanted to learn basic combat first aid, because in a serious battle, they might need every pair of hands, and several crew members volunteered immediately. Serena asked if there was anything she and the dragons could do to help, and Lisa thought for a moment and then asked if the dragons could sense other ships nearby. And Serena said yes, They had excellent awareness of their surroundings and could detect danger before normal sensors picked it. Lisa realized they had an advantage that the raiders did not know about, and she asked Serena to keep the dragons alert and report anything unusual they sensed, and this early warning system might give them the edge they needed. And Serena agreed, and said the dragons were already nervous because they could feel the hostile intent of the ships following them. The next day, Lisa's 3 friends arrived right on schedule, and they were an interesting group because there was Captain Nina Ross, who commanded a fast courier ship and had once been a military pilot, and Captain Tony Martinez, who ran a heavily armed freighter and owed Lisa his life from an incident 5 years ago, and Captain Yuki Tanaka, whose exploration vessel had the best sensors in the sector. They held a conference call and Lisa explained the situation and all 3 captains said they were ready to fight, and Nina joked that she had been getting bored with peaceful cargo runs anyway and could use some excitement. And Tony said that he had always wanted to punch some raiders in the face. And Yuki said quietly that protecting endangered species was worth any risk. Together, the 4 ships formed a convoy, and they arranged themselves in a defensive formation, with Lisa's ship in the center, because it carried the most precious cargo, and they continued toward the nebula, because there was no way around it, and they all knew the raiders would be waiting. Shimmer became restless as they approached the nebula, and she paced back and forth in the cargo bay and made anxious sounds, and Kelly stayed with her and tried to calm her. But the dragon knew danger was coming, and Frost and Hope were equally agitated, and Serena sang to them continuously to keep them from panicking. The attack came exactly when Amy had predicted, and suddenly the nebula lit up with weapons fire as a dozen raider ships emerged from hiding and surrounded the convoy, and Lisa shouted orders, and her crew responded instantly. Because they had trained for this moment, Nina's ship darted forward and drew fire from 3 raiders, while Tony's freighter unleashed a barrage of missiles that scattered the enemy formation, and Yuki provided targeting data that allowed all 4 ships to coordinate their attacks, and the space around them became a chaotic battlefield. Lisa flew her ship with precision and Kelly fired their weapons with deadly accuracy, and they worked together like they had been doing this their whole lives. And Pete kept the shields strong even as the raiders hammered them from multiple directions, and Rita coordinated damage control teams as systems failed under the assault down in the cargo bay. Serena made a decision that would change everything, because she could see through the security monitors that her friends were struggling, and she knew the dragons could help, but using their power again so soon might harm them. And she looked at Shimmer and Frost and Hope and asked them if they were willing to try. The 3 dragons responded immediately with determined chirps, and they gathered close to Serena, and she began to sing. And this time her song was different because it was not just about protection, but about strength and courage, and the will to fight for those you loved. The light that emerged from the dragons was brighter than before, and it spread not just through Lisa's ship, but touched the other 3 vessels as well, and suddenly, all 4 ships were surrounded by shimmering barriers that deflected enemy fire, and their weapons hit harder and their engines responded faster. The raiders must have realized they were facing something beyond their understanding, because several of them broke formation and tried to flee, but Nina and Tony pursued them and made sure they would not return, and the remaining raiders fought desperately. But they were outmatched, and one by one their ships were disabled or destroyed. When the battle finally ended, the nebula was quiet except for the hum of engines and drifting debris. And Lisa checked in with her fellow captains, and everyone reported damage, but no casualties. And Nina said she had never seen anything like that light, and asked what kind of secret weapon Lisa was carrying. Lisa smiled and said she would explain everything later, and she ran to the cargo bay where she found Serena unconscious on the floor with the dragons draped across her body, and they were all breathing but barely, and Kelly was already there with Rita, and they were providing medical care. Rita said that Serena had pushed herself beyond her limits and the dragons had given more than they should have, and they all needed immediate rest and proper medical treatment, and Lisa ordered the convoy to make best speed toward the Elven outpost because they were running out of time. Pete reported that their ship had taken significant damage, and they had lost several key systems, but the engines were still working, and they could make it if nothing else went wrong, and Lisa told him to do whatever it took to keep them moving. Over the next few hours, Serena drifted in and out of consciousness, and whenever she woke, the first thing she did was check on her dragons and make sure they were alive. And Kelly stayed by her side the entire time and held her hand and told her that everyone was safe and they were going to make it. The 3 dragons recovered slowly, and they remained close to each other for comfort, and Shimmer kept her head resting on Kelly's lap, and the young woman stroked her scales gently and whispered that they were the bravest creatures she had ever met. Lisa stood on the bridge and looked at the damage reports and the fuel levels and the distance remaining to the Elven outpost, and she did the calculations in her head and realized they were cutting it very close, but they would make it, and she felt exhausted, but also more alive than she had felt in years. Nina sent a message saying that she and the others would escort them all the way to Elven space and they were not leaving until they saw this mission completed, and Lisa thanked her and thought about how lucky she was to have friends like these. Amy detected the border of Elven space on her sensors and she announced that they would arrive at the outpost in less than a day. And a cheer went up from the crew because they had made it through the gauntlet and completed what everyone had said was impossible. The Elven outpost appeared on their sensors like a gleaming jewel against the darkness of space, and it was enormous with multiple docking rings and habitation modules that housed thousands of people, and Amy guided their damaged ship toward the designated landing bay, while the other 3 vessels took up positions nearby. Within minutes of their arrival, a dozen Elven security ships surrounded them, and their commander sent a terse message demanding to know why human vessels were approaching their station. And Lisa responded calmly that they were escorting one of their people home and they came in peace. There was a long pause, and then a different voice came over the communications channel, and it was older and filled with authority, and the speaker identified himself as Council Elder Theron, and he asked if they carried a xenobiologist named Serena aboard their ship. Lisa confirmed that Serena was with them, along with 3 dragons, and she briefly explained what had happened, and how they had fought their way through raider attacks to bring them to safety. And another long silence followed her words, and she could almost feel the shock on the other end of the transmission. Elder Theron finally spoke again, and his voice was thick with emotion, and he said that Serena had been missing for weeks and they had feared the worst, and he requested permission to board Lisa's ship immediately, and Lisa granted it, because she could hear the genuine concern in his voice. The docking procedures took 20 minutes, and during that time, Rita worked to stabilize Serena, who was still weak from overusing her connection with the dragons, and the 3 creatures remained close to their guardian and refused to leave her side, even when Kelly tried to move them to a more comfortable location. When the airlock finally opened, a group of elves entered led by Elder Theron, who was tall even by Elven standards with white hair and eyes that had seen centuries of life, and he moved quickly despite his apparent age and headed straight for the cargo bay where Serena lay. The moment he saw her, his composure broke, and he knelt beside her and took her hand and spoke to her in their language, and Serena's eyes opened and she smiled weakly and responded in the same tongue, and the dragons recognized Elder Theron and chirped happily, and climbed onto him like they had known him their whole lives. Elder Theron looked at the 3 dragons with wonder, and tears streamed down his face because he was old enough to remember when dragons had filled the skies, and seeing them alive and healthy was like witnessing a miracle. And he turned to Lisa and her crew and said something in Elven that sounded like a blessing. One of the younger elves who had come with the elder stepped forward and introduced herself as Kira, and she offered to translate, because not all of the council members spoke human language fluently, and Lisa thanked her and said that would be helpful. Elder Theron spoke through Kira and said that the Elven people owed humanity a debt that could never be fully repaid, because these dragons represented hope for their entire civilization, and without them, the ancient bond between elves and dragons would have been lost forever. Lisa felt uncomfortable with such formal gratitude, and she said they had only done what anyone should do when someone needs help, and Elder Theron shook his head and said that many species would have turned away or demanded payment, but humans had risked their lives for strangers, and that spoke to the character of their people. The medical team that Elder Theron had brought immediately began treating Serena and the dragons, and they had specialized equipment designed specifically for dragon care, and they worked with practiced efficiency, and within an hour Serena was sitting up and looking much better, and the dragons were eating and playing again, Elder Theron invited Lisa and her senior crew to a formal reception that the council was organizing in their honor. And Lisa tried to decline because she did not feel comfortable with ceremonies, but Kelly whispered that it would be rude to refuse, and Pete agreed, and said that sometimes you had to accept gratitude, even when it felt awkward. The reception hall was beautiful, with walls that seemed to be made of living crystal, and plants that glowed with soft bioluminescence, and hundreds of elves had gathered to see the humans who had saved their last dragons. And the crowd parted as Lisa and her crew entered. Nina and Tony and Yuki had also been invited, and they stood together looking uncomfortable in their work clothes because none of them had expected to attend a formal event. And Lisa smiled at them because they were all in the same situation. The council members sat on a raised platform, and Elder Theron stood and addressed the crowd in Elven and then in human language, and he told the story of how Serena had been attacked, and how Lisa and her crew had not hesitated to help, and how they had fought off multiple raider attacks to bring her home safely. When he finished speaking, the entire hall erupted in applause, and the sound was overwhelming, and Lisa felt her face turn red because she had never been comfortable being the center of attention, and Kelly squeezed her hand supportively. Elder Theron then did something unexpected, and he descended from the platform and approached Lisa, and he bowed deeply, which caused a collective gasp from the assembled elves because council elders did not bow to anyone, and he said that from this day forward, humans would be considered honored friends of the elven people. He presented Lisa with a small crystal that pulsed with inner light, and he explained through Kira that it contained a recording of the dragon song, and if humans ever needed help from the elves, they need only play this song, and assistance would come, no matter the distance or danger. Lisa accepted the crystal with shaking hands, and she said that she hoped the friendship between their peoples would grow stronger, and that maybe they could learn to trust each other more and work together for the good of the galaxy. The reception continued for hours with food and music and conversation, and Serena appeared halfway through looking tired but happy. And the dragons were with her, and they flew around the hall, delighting the crowd who had not seen such creatures in generations. Shimmer found Kelly immediately and landed on her shoulder, and Kelly laughed and fed her small pieces of fruit, and several young elves gathered around to ask questions about the journey, and Kelly told them stories about the battles and the dragon's magic. Lisa found herself talking with Elder Theron about politics and trade and the complicated history between humans and elves. And the elder admitted that his people had been too proud and too isolated, and they had missed opportunities for friendship because of old prejudices, said that what Lisa and her crew had done proved that humans valued life and honor above profit and prejudice, and that was the mark of a truly advanced civilization. And Lisa said that humans were not perfect, and they made plenty of mistakes, but they tried to do better, and that was all anyone could do. As the evening wore on, Serena approached Lisa and asked if they could speak privately, and they found a quiet balcony overlooking the station's gardens, and Serena said that she wanted Lisa to know how much her help had meant. She explained that she had spent years feeling alone in her mission to save the dragons, and many of her own people had thought she was wasting her time chasing an impossible dream. And there had been moments when she had almost given up, but then Lisa and her crew had appeared, and they had believed in her mission without question, and they had fought for her and for the dragons, like they were family, and that kind of selfless courage was rare in the galaxy, and Serena would never forget it. Lisa said that she was glad they had been in the right place at the right time, and she asked what would happen to the dragons now, and Serena smiled and said they would be taken to a special facility where they would be carefully studied and bred, and within a few years there would be dozens of dragons and eventually hundreds. She said that Hope would be particularly important because she carried genetic diversity that her parents lacked, and she would be the mother of a new generation, and Lisa said she was honored to have played a small part in saving such magnificent creatures. The next morning, Lisa and her crew prepared to depart, and the repairs to their ship had been completed by elven engineers, who had worked through the night, and Pete was amazed at the quality of the work and said their systems were running better than they had in years. Serena came to say goodbye, and she brought the dragons with her, and Shimmer flew to Kelly and rubbed against her face, and Kelly cried and hugged the golden dragon and promised to visit someday. Elder Theron presented each crew member with a small gift as a token of appreciation, and he told them they would always have friends among the elves, and Lisa thanked him and said she hoped this was just the beginning of better relations between their peoples. As their ship pulled away from the station, Lisa stood on the bridge and watched the elven outpost grow smaller, and she thought about everything that had happened and how a simple distress call had turned into an adventure that would be remembered for generations. Kelly came and stood beside her and said that she would miss the dragons, and Lisa said she would too. But they had done something important and they had made a real difference, and that was what mattered. Amy set course for home, and Pete engaged the engines and they left elven space behind. But Lisa knew they carried something precious with them, which was the knowledge that sometimes the greatest rewards came not from seeking profit or glory, but from simply helping those in need. The journey back to human space took 2 weeks and the ship felt strangely empty. Without Serena, and the dragons and the crew found themselves talking about their adventure constantly, because it was hard to believe that everything had really happened. And Kelly kept the small scale that Shimmer had shed as a gift, and she looked at it every day. News of their mission had spread through both human and elven territories faster than their ship could travel. And when they finally approached Earth orbit, they were greeted by 3 military vessels and a message from the Admiralty requesting that Captain Lisa Monroe report immediately for debriefing. Lisa had expected this, but she had hoped for a few days of rest first, and she told her crew to take shore leave while she dealt with the officials, and Pete said he would come with her for moral support. And Amy volunteered as well because she had been the one tracking their route and the battles. The Admiralty headquarters was an imposing building in Geneva, and Lisa had only been there twice before, and both times had been unpleasant experiences with bureaucrats who cared more about regulations than about doing the right thing. And she walked through the marble corridors with growing anxiety. Admiral Patricia Stone met them in a conference room, and she was a stern woman in her 60s with gray hair and sharp eyes. And Lisa had heard stories about her being fair but demanding, and the Admiral gestured for them to sit and said she wanted to hear everything from the beginning. Lisa told the story honestly, and she did not try to make herself sound heroic or downplay the dangers they had faced. And she explained how they had found Serena and the dragons, and how they had decided to help despite knowing it would be dangerous, and Admiral Stone listened without interrupting. When Lisa finished, the Admiral was quiet for a long moment, and then she said that Lisa had violated at least a dozen regulations by entering elven space without authorization and engaging in combat with raiders without backup, and technically she should be facing disciplinary action. Lisa felt her stomach sink, but she kept her expression neutral, and she said she understood, but she would make the same choices again, because some things were more important than regulations. And Admiral Stone's stern expression softened slightly, and she said that was exactly what she had hoped to hear. The Admiral explained that the Elven Council had sent an official communication to Earth, thanking humanity for the rescue, and proposing new trade agreements, and cultural exchanges and diplomatic relations between humans and elves had improved more in the past 2 weeks than they had in the previous 50 years. She said that Lisa's actions had opened doors that politicians and diplomats had been trying to open for decades, and while the Admiralty could not officially condone breaking regulations, they recognized that sometimes the right thing to do was not the same as the legal thing to do. Admiral Stone stood and extended her hand, and she said that instead of disciplinary action, Lisa was being commended for exceptional service, and her crew would receive recognition as well. And Lisa shook her hand and felt relief wash over her. The Admiral also mentioned that several news organizations wanted to interview Lisa and her crew, and there was already talk of making a documentary about their journey, and Lisa groaned because she hated publicity. But the Admiral said it would be good for human and elven relations if people heard the real story. Over the next few days, Lisa and her crew became minor celebrities, and their faces appeared on news broadcasts across human space, and people stopped them on the street to thank them or ask questions. And Kelly enjoyed the attention more than Lisa did, but even she grew tired of repeating the same stories. Nina and Tony and Yuki also received recognition for their part in the mission, and the 4 captains met for dinner at a restaurant in New York, and they laughed about their adventure and joked that they should make escorting endangered species their new specialty. 3 months after their return, Lisa received a message from Serena, and it included a video that made her entire crew gather around to watch. And in the video, Serena stood in a large habitat filled with trees and streams, and behind her were not 3 dragons, but 7, because the breeding program had been successful beyond all expectations. Shimmer and Frost had produced 4 healthy eggs, and all of them had hatched, and the babies were tiny and adorable, and they tumbled over each other playing, while their parents watched protectively and Hope had bonded with a young male dragon that the elves had discovered in a remote region, and together they represented new genetic diversity. Serena explained that the dragon population was growing steadily, and the elves were preparing to release some of them into the wild within a year, and she thanked Lisa and her crew again and said that none of this would have been possible without their courage and kindness. At the end of the video, Shimmer appeared and she chirped at the camera, and Serena laughed and said that the golden dragon remembered Kelly and missed her, and Kelly wiped tears from her eyes and said she missed Shimmer too. Lisa decided to send a response video, and she gathered her crew on the bridge and they recorded a message, congratulating Serena on her success and telling her about how their lives had changed since returning home, and how they thought about the dragons often. Kelly held up the scale that Shimmer had given her, and she said she kept it with her always, as a reminder that friendship could cross any boundary, whether it was between species or between stars. And Pete added that they were proud to have been part of something so important. Life gradually returned to normal, and Lisa went back to hauling. Cargo and her crew resumed their regular duties, but everything felt different now, because they had seen what was possible when people worked together regardless of their differences. 6 months after their adventure, Lisa received an official invitation from the Elven Council to attend the first dragon release ceremony, and she was told she could bring her entire crew and any guests she wished, and the invitation included transportation on an elven vessel. The crew was excited beyond words, and they spent weeks preparing for the journey. And Kelly bought new clothes, and Pete read everything he could find about elven culture, and Amy practiced speaking basic elven phrases, and Rita organized gifts to bring for Serena. The elven ship that picked them up was beautiful and sleek, and the crew treated the humans like honored guests, and the journey to the elven homeworld took 5 days, and every moment was filled with new experiences and fascinating conversations. When they finally arrived at the elven homeworld, Lisa stood at the observation window and gasped, because the planet was breathtaking with blue oceans and green continents and cities that looked like they had grown naturally from the landscape rather than being built. Serena met them at the spaceport, and she hugged each crew member like they were family, and she looked healthier and happier than Lisa had ever seen her, and she said she had so much to show them. The Dragon facility was located in a mountain valley, and it was enormous with multiple habitats designed to mimic different environments, and Serena gave them a complete tour and introduced them to every dragon, and there were now 23 individuals ranging from tiny hatchlings to the original. Adult Shimmer recognized Kelly immediately, and she flew across the habitat and landed on her shoulders and rubbed her head against Kelly's face and made happy chirping sounds, and Kelly laughed and cried at the same time and said she had missed her friend so much. The release ceremony took place the next day, and thousands of elves gathered to witness it, and Elder Theron gave a speech about hope and perseverance, and how sometimes salvation came from unexpected places, and he acknowledged Lisa and her crew and asked them to stand, and the crowd applauded for several minutes. Then the moment arrived, and the handlers opened the habitat gates, and 5 young dragons flew out into the open sky, and they soared and dove and called to each other with joy, and the crowd cheered, and many people cried, including Lisa, who understood that she was witnessing the rebirth of a species. Serena stood beside Lisa, and she said that within 10 years dragons would fly over every elven world, and the ancient bond between her people and these magnificent creatures would be restored, and it was all because one human captain had answered a distress call. Lisa watched the dragons disappear into the distance, and she thought about how one simple choice had led to all of this, and she realized that every person had the power to change the universe if they were willing to take action when it mattered. That evening there was a celebration, and Lisa danced with Elder Theron, who proved surprisingly graceful despite his age, and Kelly spent the entire night with Shimmer, who would be released in the next ceremony, and Pete discussed engineering with elven scientists, and Amy made friends with elven navigators. As the party wound down, Lisa found a quiet spot on a balcony overlooking the valley, and Serena joined her, and they stood in comfortable silence watching the stars. And finally Serena said that she hoped Lisa understood how much her friendship meant, Lisa said that helping Serena had been one of the best decisions she had ever made, and she asked if they would stay in touch, and Serena laughed and said that nothing could keep them apart now because they were sisters in all but blood. The next morning, as Lisa and her crew prepared to return home, Shimmer gave Kelly another scale, and the dragon sang a soft melody that brought tears to everyone's eyes, and Serena translated that it was a promise to remember and to meet again.